The Boruto franchise has officially crossed 10 million copies in Japan, covering all 20 volumes of Boruto Naruto Next Generations and the first 5 volumes of Boruto 2 Blue Vortex. Volume 6 just came out, so it's not counted in this total. This milestone was just confirmed to us by Shueisha themselves, and honestly, it's a very incredible achievement that deserves to be celebrated and not downplayed like I'm seeing. For years, you've had a lot of people try to weaponize the sales charts, and they push narratives and they twist up statistics that Boruto somehow is not successful. But today I'm going to be breaking down exactly why this new information proves that all of that is false, why this number matters, and why Boruto hitting 10 million in Japan alone, no other country counted, that puts it in rare company, and this is a really big deal. However, if you're someone who thinks that tens of million is not a number to celebrate, and you're looking at outlier manga like One Piece, Naruto, Dragon Ball, which have hit the hundreds of million milestone in terms of what's out there for them, or even series like Bleach and My Hero Academia and Attack on Titan that have over 100 million, this video should serve as an educational one. And I strongly recommend looking at the video I did, The Truth About Boruto Sales, which will be linked down below in the description, where I go further into detail about Boruto's manga sales and explain how Boruto, Dragon Ball Super, Rurouni Kenshin Hokkaido arc, despite each of them not pulling in 10% of what their parent series did, they still far outperform most of the manga market each year, and each, including Boruto, defied the typical fate of manga sequels where they don't even pull in 1% of their parent series, making them outliers. So let's just start with the elephant in the room, the Oricon charts that you've probably seen. For years, detractors, they've thrown out the Oricon numbers, which are basically the first 8 weeks the manga's on sale, where they track everything and they say, hey, Boruto's failing, Boruto's about to get axed. But here's the problem. Those numbers don't tell the whole story, and some of the people pushing that nonsense, they know as much. When Boruto launched, it was running in Weekly Shonen Jump, a magazine that pushes out 1.4 million copies every single week. Later on, when Boruto switched to V-Jump magazine for a more consistent schedule, because before, when Boruto's manga came out, it was on a regular schedule. We just knew that it was coming at some point during a month, but never a consistent date. V-Jump magazine, the chapters usually come out on the 20th every month. Because V-Jump magazine is a more expensive manga, significantly more expensive, it only releases 140,000 copies every issue. Of course, the raw Oricon numbers, they're gonna look lower because the exposure funnel is completely different. Yet despite those differences, Boruto's managed to maintain a consistent floor of 100,000 copies per volume at a bare minimum that have been out there in Japan. That 100,000, you can bank on Boruto's manga typically selling 100,000 copies. That is a consistent floor. And here's the thing that people miss for the forest for the trees. In the Japanese publishing market, digital sales, they're king. Physical sales only make up about 30% of the overall market. Even for Shueisha, which leans a lot heavier into print because of its audience, physical accounts for roughly 47% of their sales revenue. So even then, physical's not a majority for Shueisha as of the last numbers I've seen. But with year over year, those numbers continuing to go down and digital continuing to go up, for a series to consistently be able to bank in bare minimum 100,000 copies sold, that's a really big deal. In business, consistency is your best friend. While you have detractors who point to the Oricon physical sales and rankings, what they ignore is that Boruto quietly continues to move copies, especially on backlogs. That's where the Soseki information comes into play. Boruto has very strong backlogs. Like the last thing I saw for Boruto 2 Blue Vortex Volume 1 is somewhere in the ballpark of 140,000 to 150,000. It fell off of Oricon's charts at 109,000 if I'm not mistaken. But let's go with something a little bit more concrete. Let's look at Boruto Naruto Next Generations. To give you an idea of how much backlogs are, Volume 10 fell off at 169,000 copies sold. However, just because it fell off of the Oricon chart does not mean that it stopped selling. Just because it fell out the top 500 does not mean it stopped selling. The updated numbers for Volume 10 are 207,000. That's almost a 50,000 jump, give or take. It continued to sell. Just like Volume 13 of Boruto Naruto Next Generations, it did 204,000 in total. But when it fell off the charts, it was at 156,000. Boruto has a very strong backlog. That is why Shueisha is saying, hey, we have 10 million copies in circulation right now. It shouldn't shock anybody who's being objective. And that 10 million number is Japan only. Boruto also is a strong digital seller. It's not doing insane digital numbers, but it is enough to balance the scale. And it is enough to prove that Boruto does have staying power. And for a company like Shueisha, when you look at their Shonen Jump Plus app, you're able to earn tickets by reading chapters and going through the various ads. This is the Japanese only app, by the way, but it takes a long time to rack up enough points to purchase a manga volume. You can directly purchase tickets. Typically, Boruto manga volumes cost around 500 tickets, and there is an option to purchase, which is basically to rent the manga volume. Japan, in a lot of ways, still operates the way that if you're a 90s kid or early 2000s kid, you remember going to video stores where you would rent movies. It's the same thing. The other thing you have to keep in mind with Oricon is that Oricon does not track digital at all, because digital sales are basically information that only the publisher has, because only Rakuten knows how many copies they sold digitally. Only Amazon knows how many copies they sold digitally. That's not anything that is released to tracking companies like that. That's why you can't just look at those charts and think you're seeing the fuller picture. Now, I do want to go further here. This is a rarity for Boruto's manga volumes, and I don't think people understand this. That's why this whole goalpost moving is happening where, oh, well, 10 million in Japan's not that big of a deal. Respectfully, you don't know what the fuck you're talking about. So here's what fans underestimate. There's this tendency to use outliers to define the standard. Just as we'll have people that will look at YouTube and say if a video does not do 100,000, the video is a failure, even though that is 0.77% of all videos for their lifetime on YouTube that hit 100,000 views. 90% of videos uploaded don't hit 1,000 views that are uploaded. So just how rare is it for manga to sell 100,000 copies per volume? So nearly 80% of manga that are released in Japan every year never break 20,000 copies across their entire lifespan. That means you can have a manga that's been out for 10 years. It ain't sold 20,000 copies. Boruto literally has enough of a cult fan base that it does that usually in 2 to 4 days, depending on how long the sales week is, because sales weeks are not a full 7 days. A lot of the times it's 2, 3, 4 days. You might get lucky and get a 5-day week. Less than 1% of manga titles reach 100,000 copies per volume. Let me restate that. Less than 1% of manga titles reach 100,000 copies per volume. That means Boruto isn't struggling. It's literally in the top percentile of the entire industry. Is it doing 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 800,000 copies? Is it doing 1 million copies a volume like One Piece? No, those are your extreme outliers. Anything over 100,000, that is you fighting to see how far into the top 1% you are. When you see a manga that does 500,000 to 600,000 copies, that's not just success. That's literally being in the top 10th of a percentage. That is a different universe of popularity. Not reaching that number doesn't make you unsuccessful. Boruto doesn't need to be in that tier to be considered successful by definition. That is why when you look at the Japanese bookstores or some of the print stuff, you'll see the signs and everything that say a hit manga, because it quite literally is. It is in the top 1%. If you are a top 1% earner in your profession and somebody looks at you and say, hey, you are a bum, you're going to look at them like they're crazy. It's the same thing here. It's already comfortably outperforming 99% of the industry. And that's why the 10 million mark, that is very meaningful. It shows it's not just a flash in the pan hype, but instead it is a consistent, sustained success. And again, as somebody that runs a couple businesses outside of YouTube, I can tell you, having a steady floor in terms of what you can expect from a business to generate an income, that is what you want. You always want to see the cash flow growth increase, but if you have a steady floor, you run with it, because it at least allows you to plan based on that bare minimum. Which that brings me to the next point. This number is only in Japan. That is something that you'll see people try to say, oh, that's cope, that's not true. I've run this by a few translators I trust, and I've also gone back at the suggestion of my guy Kaz to go back and compare other press releases that we've had from Shueisha, Konoha, and some more other companies, publishers. This is not 10 million worldwide. This is only Japan. That anyone telling you that, they're lying to you. Shueisha is extremely specific in how they report sales. When the figure is for Japan only, they don't add qualifiers. When the figure is worldwide, they always use the word Zenseke, which means worldwide. And they typically have that word, and then they'll have cumulative total right after that. They did this for Black Clover, for example. They announced the global sales milestone. That's typically when Shueisha does that. Over, it hit 24 million worldwide. They announced that before there was the announcement for the anime returning. That's why you do that. You need to drive up extra hype for the upcoming Black Clover anime. This is coming from somebody who is a big Black Clover fan. When they're reporting on global milestones, that's when they go through and they have that phrasing. In this case, Shueisha gave no specific specification. This is consistent with their own reporting standards. The 10 million is strictly for Japan, and this makes sense. Why? Because this is something that Japanese fans are seeing. Japan is the primary market. It is the home audience, and that is the one that matters the most to publishers. Typically, when they talk about sales, they're talking about what it earns Japan. Overseas numbers are reported separately and only when they hit a major milestone. So anyone trying to blur that line, they're misrepresenting the reality because they're trying to push an agenda. I also want to kind of compare Boruto to Dragon Ball Super. Let's add more into perspective, since both of them are sequels to two of the biggest mangas in history. Boruto has 10 million in Japan. Dragon Ball Super is the sequel to the godfather of modern shonen, Dragon Ball. It sits at 12 million in Japan. That is only a 2 million difference. Naruto and Dragon Ball are the number 3 and number 2 respective best-selling Shonen Jump manga of all time. The gap between their two sequels and the original mangas are relatively similar. Dragon Ball is at 250 million. Naruto is at 240 million. Dragon Ball Super is at 12 million. Boruto is at 10 million. Again, Japanese only. Their sequels were always going to face impossibly high standards. But if Dragon Ball Super, when it got reported back in April, was widely accepted as being a success because it had 12 million in Japan, then Boruto at 10 million deserves the exact same respect. Both of them have been without an anime for a very long time, years. Dragon Ball Super since 2018, Boruto since 2023. You can't have it both ways. Either both are successful or neither is. 2 million is not that big of a gap. Shouts out to my guy for Neverworld, who predicted this a year ago when he talked about Boruto and Dragon Ball Super sales. Now, in terms of the worldwide numbers, If you're still not impressed, let's go worldwide, since people want to talk worldwide. This is based on confirmed data. According to the confirmed data, whereas Dragon Ball Super is at 12 million in Japan, 4.5 million in France, 1.2 million in the United States, for a total of 17.7 million volumes, which that US number being as big as it is makes a huge difference. Boruto is not a big seller in the United States. Naruto fans in the US do not fuck with Boruto. Let's look at the Boruto numbers and look at how close Boruto and Dragon Ball Super are. In Japan, Boruto has 10 million. France has 3 million. Italy has 1.2 million. Spain has 800,000. Germany has 600,000. The United States has 450,000, which that is a massive drop off compared to what Naruto did. Like Naruto did, if I'm not mistaken, 8 or 9 million in the United States. Then in the UK, you have 400,000. This brings Boruto's worldwide total up to 16.4 million. Again, that is not something to dismiss. This is a series that consistently has a relatively good footing in terms of it being a success. Let's go even further here. Boruto 2 Blue Vortex, the sequel to Boruto Naruto Next Generations, in just 4 manga volumes has 1 million copies. That is again confirmed by Shueisha. That is 250,000 on average. That is huge, especially when you consider that Boruto currently again has no anime promotion. The anime promotes the manga. Think about that. Most major shonen titles rely on the anime to keep their presence out there. That is why when a series like Demon Slayer comes out, manga sales, they shoot up because the anime draws eyes to the manga. Demon Slayer was not this massive sales phenomenon until like episode 18 or 19 in the anime, and the sales spiked at episode 24, and now it's the juggernaut that's on its way to catching Naruto. It's like 20 million behind Naruto at this point. It might even be 10. Boruto 2 Blue Vortex getting 1 million so far, not counting volume 5 or 6. That is pretty big. That speaks volumes to the strength of the brand and the audience interest in the new direction that you've got. Let's add some further context to this. So you might be asking, how big of a deal is getting 10 million? So in Shonen Jump's 50 plus years of being in publication, the exact number should be 56 years in publication. 56 years worth of history. If you put Boruto in Weekly Shonen Jump, just as a special monthly manga appearance, don't even have to be weekly, and you add in that 10 million number, where would Boruto rank? It'd be a top 60 manga out the history of Weekly Shonen Jump. It would be just behind a series like Dandadan, which is at 12 million in Japan. Dandadan is a big series. Last time I checked, if you say otherwise, respectfully, you don't know what the hell you're talking about. And even with Dandadan, if I'm not mistaken, that don't run in Weekly Shonen Jump. That's on Jump Plus, if I'm not mistaken. But the point being on that is that that's a top 60 manga out the 56-year history, which means that keep going at this rate, you're going to start knocking on the door to being top 40. Top 40 is nothing to turn your nose up at. Not for the biggest magazine in Japan's history. Again, Boruto's in V-Jump magazine. I'm using Weekly Shonen Jump because it's the bigger name to show you what Boruto would do if it was a Jump title, a Weekly Shonen Jump title. But the fact that it and Dragon Ball Super and Rurouni Kenshin are putting up those kinds of numbers in a smaller magazine, Jump Plus for Dragon Ball Super and Boruto, and Jump Square Rise for Rurouni Kenshin Hokkaido art, it speaks volumes to the fact that even though they're only pulling in about 5% of their original fan base, they're still putting up numbers that have beaten the curse that you get with sequels. Typically, sequels do not perform this well. Even with a title like Fairy Tail 100 Years Quest. Fairy Tail sold 75 million volumes. It was one of the bigger manga in the late 2000s and early 2010s. There was a time where when we had big three conversations, people used to try and sneak Fairy Tail in there and say that Fairy Tail is part of the big four. Fairy Tail 100 Year Quest don't even do 50,000 a volume. It's somewhere in that 30 to 40,000 range. So you get the point of what I'm saying. And that's no knock on Fairy Tail 100 Years Quest. Going by the numbers, it is a success. That is why it has never been canceled in Weekly Shonen magazine. That is why Kodansha still continues to pump out manga volumes, because it is technically a success, a big success at that. It's just when you get onto Twitter, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, and etc., people start saying dumbass stuff like 100,000 a volume is a failure, when it really isn't. Hopefully you enjoyed this video. You found it informative. Normally this would be the type of video that I would send out to an editor, but because this is a news video, I wanted to try and get this up as soon as possible. I will leave linked that bigger video I talked about at the start of this one that goes into extensive detail on Boruto sales and sequels and etc. Very informative, and that was an editor I very much enjoyed working with. Their prices got a little bit too expensive for me to continue using them. But if you want to learn more about the industry and etc., I strongly recommend that video that you can watch here.